Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to demonstrate one method of making a touch mark. A touch mark is a stamp that's driven into the surface of the metal to identify the maker. For smiths working in precious metals, they were one stamp in a group of hallmarks that were stamped on each piece. Smiths working in wrought iron never used touch marks, so the practice today of stamping our work is just to quickly identify the piece as a modern reproduction and prevent it from being passed off as a historical piece. The biggest problem with making a touch mark is dealing with their size. They have to be small enough to fit on the smallest piece of ironwork that you make. So being able to carve detail into something that's that small is a real challenge. For this demonstration, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I'm just carving out the initials of my name. And when you're starting out, that's about the best place to start. Just something that you can do freehand and just get used to working on that scale. The first step is to transfer the design to the face of the punch. If I was working with a more complicated design, I would print the design out and then glue it to the surface of the stamp, and then I would use a center punch to transfer the design to the face of the stamp. But since I'm just working with some basic block lettering, I'm just going to use the center punch to lay out some rough guidelines to work from. I quite often use an electric engraving pencil to transfer the outline of a paper pattern, but this won't work here because the piece is so small. By the time you got that centered in on the line, you would have the whole face of the stamp marked with center punch marks. But with a center punch, I can take my time, line it up where it needs to go, and then just tap it into the surface. And don't forget that everything that you stamp into the surface of this stamp has to be the mirror image of the final design that you want. That may not be a problem if you're using a symbol as your mark, but if you're using lettering, it has to be facing the right way when you stamp it. So these few marks gives me a clear picture of what I need to remove. That is, as long as I don't walk away from it for too long. The grouping on the right is the center hole of the letter D, and the two horizontal lines on the left are the two arms of the letter F. To make the initial cuts, I'm using a narrow chisel that has a rounded profile on the bottom. This one chisel allows me to make a light pass and cut a narrow line and then reinforce that line and make it a little wider simply by driving the chisel through a second time a little bit deeper. For this stamp, I'm going to be cutting out the negative spaces, so that means that the actual lettering is going to stay on the surface of the stamp, and that's going to be driven the deepest into the work. And the parts surrounding the letters are actually going to be raised up slightly. Now you'll notice that this bottom line for the F isn't actually a line, it's a series of dots. That's to remind me that I need to clear away all the metal here. That's the bottom of the letter. When you're working on something that's this small and that's actually backwards, it's pretty easy to forget details like that. So you need to be able to develop your own shorthand to remind you of, where everything is supposed to be. At this point, I'm just blocking out the negative spaces. Nothing is to the final dimensions. I'm just getting everything proportioned more or less, and then I'll be fine-tuning that later. I know this looks like I'm taking away a lot of metal here, but without a lot of magnification, I can barely make this out. They're just very, very fine lines. And even with the best magnification that I have, I'm finding it very, very difficult to create a clean design. Next, I'm going to be bringing in a regular square-edged chisel just to start cleaning up and defining some of the lines. So I finished the initial pass. It's still pretty rough looking, but you can start to identify the letters. At this point, I'm going to take the time to do a test run and punch it into some hot metal. And it's really important to do that on a regular basis while you're making the stamp, because it's really hard to tell how the work that you're doing is going to transfer to the metal. So here's the initial punch, and you can see that all the irregularities that made the stamp look terrible really didn't transfer to the metal at all. It actually looks pretty good. At this point, I'm just going to keep on concentrating on getting to the final dimensions of the letters and cleaning up the edges as much as I can. The space that I'm working on right now is the negative space under the letter F. I noticed in the sample that that space wasn't well defined because the chisel cuts were coming through at different levels. So what I'm trying to do now is just level it off as much as I can. Even though these are negative spaces, they are raised up in the design, so if you have a lot of lines cutting through them, it can make the design kind of fuzzy and hard to read. For the stamp to be clear and easily understood, each section of the stamp should read as its own level. The top surface is easy because you're starting off with a surface that's filed flat, but everything that you carve into that stamp also needs to finish off in a relatively flat plane. Each section doesn't have to be at the same level as another section in the design, but the whole area should read as a flat surface. And here once again I'm ready to give it another test to see how the work that I did is going to transfer to the metal. This sample piece shows a great improvement over the first sample, but there's still a lot of cleanup to be done. You can see very clearly here how this poorly defined negative space is making this letter F look more like an E or even a poorly shaped number 6. So I definitely need to clean that up. And I also see that I need to define and square up the top of the letter F. These punches need to be made out of a high carbon steel to hold up well. I usually make mine out of sections of coil spring, but if you're planning to do a lot of work and are going to be using these often, you probably should invest in a better quality tool steel. These stamps need to be heat treated, of course, and for a spring steel like 5160, I usually just temper it to a very light straw color. That leaves the stamp very hard, but it gives it enough impact resistance to be driven into hot metal. The other thing you need to consider when you're designing a Touchmark is that very simple, broad lines tend to hold up better than very fine, thin lines. So if you have a basic blocky design like I have here, you're going to get a lot of use out of that before the stamp starts to wear out. But if you have a design with a lot of thin, fine lines to it, those sections are going to start to wear out before the heavier sections, and you're going to need to rebuild that stamp a lot sooner than you would with a simpler design. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you have questions and you want to contact me directly, you can do so by emailing me at either one of the addresses that I have listed here. It may take me a couple of days, but I will get back to you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.